Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. I'm Cecile with EDF Action, the advocacy partner of Environmental Defense Fund, and I'll be moderating the conversation tonight about our landmark chemical safety law, the Toxic Substance Control Act. But before we get started, let me first thank the AFL-CIO for partnering with us tonight. We're so honored to be here together, so let's get into the program tonight. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest this evening. First, we have Rebecca Rendell. She's the Safety and Health Director at the AFL CIO. Rebecca, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role?
Sure. Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. My role is I'm the Safety and Health Director at the National AFL-CIO. We focus a lot on policies related to anything that affects workers' health and safety on the job. And, workers they go to work every day, just like many of you have done. But workers are also many other people. They are our family members, they are community members, their mothers, their sisters, their brothers. Many workers, I think, when we say workers, it's a very general category, but they're the people in our communities every day. It's all of us. So we're all fighting together for safer workplaces and so that people can return home at the end of the day or at the end of their shift. Not harmed from chemical exposures and other safety issues, and to make sure that future generations, their children, are also not harmed because of what they do every day at work.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And it's such, just a powerful reminder about why we're here. Just what you said, we're all people at the end of the day. And especially with how things are going with our political climate and affordability, jobs are more important than ever. So we're just thankful and grateful for you to bring your perspective tonight. Next up is Suhani Chitalia. She's the Senior Manager for Federal Affairs with EDF Action. Suhani, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role?
Yeah, thanks, Cecile, and thanks, Rebecca, for joining us. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Suhani Chitalia. I'm a senior manager with EDF Action, and I do a lot of our Hill and lobbying facing work around toxic chemicals, clean air, and even some of our energy work like around hydrogen. So just really grateful to spend time with y'all. My background has kind of taken many twists and turns, but after I graduated law school, a lot of my work was around land use and zoning, and it actually included how fence line communities are impacted by nearby facilities like concrete batching plants and things like that. And I actually worked really closely with a lot of workers who lived near these large scale manufacturing plants. So I deeply appreciate kind of the work that workers have to endure every day and just trying to make a living, and they absolutely deserve to have safety be the primary focus as they enter and leave their jobs. But just again, thank you so much for being here, and I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation.
Yes, thanks so much. So before we jump in to the conversation, no matter if you're joining us by YouTube or social media, just a reminder to drop some questions in the chat, interact with us, because after the conversation and after we take some action together tonight, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. So don't forget to drop some comments and give us a like and a share in the virtual room. So let's get into it. For folks who might not be familiar, what is the Toxic Substance Control Act?
Thanks, Cecile. So the Toxic Substances Control Act is, first of all, a mouthful. So I'll be referring it to as TSCA moving forward, because I don't want to keep saying it over and over again. But it is our bedrock chemical safety law. So when you think about TSCA, think about the other big environmental laws that exist in our country. Think Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. This is the law that looks at chemicals before they enter the market to make sure everything around you is safe. This includes evaluating things that are in our household, including the electronics that you utilize every day, the products underneath your kitchen sink, the toys that your children play with, the carpets that your family and dogs and kids roll around on. So it's really, really important. Like this touches everything around us every single day. What the Toxic Substances Control Act does is it requires the EPA to evaluate chemicals for safety to ensure they don't pose an unreasonable risk to people or the environment before it hits the market. The law also includes some really critical protections for people most at risk. And this includes children, pregnant women, workers, people who live near facilities. And ultimately, it keeps dangerous chemicals out of our home, our products, our communities. And these aren't just like mild chemicals. These are chemicals that can cause cancer, harm our immune system, reduce fertility. I think that there's kind of this like misnomer that the chemicals that are in our everyday use are completely fine, but they're actually often very highly toxic and they have to be managed as such. So that's just a quick overview of TSCA. I'll probably get into more as we continue this discussion, but I think the big thing to take away is that it's kind of the gatekeeper for dangerous chemicals before they end up in our everyday lives.
Yeah, that's right, Suhani. And it's so important because another maybe misconception too for folks is that, oh, you can buy your way out of the problem, right? You can look for a certain label or look for certain things. And that's why pieces of legislation like the Toxic Substance Control Act are so important, right? We rely on our EPA and our government to protect us from some of these things. And really, really glad that we're coming together tonight to have this conversation, especially with Rebecca. So where do these chemicals, how do they show up? Well, can you tell us a little bit more about how they show up in our everyday lives?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, these chemicals really do show up everywhere. And what's really, I think, important to remember is that TSCA is a cradle to grave statute. What does that mean? It means that it looks at a chemical from its manufacturing point to its disposal point. So it's not just like, oh, like the chemical in my mouse, for example. It's how was this manufactured? What chemicals were used in the facility? What were the workers exposed to? Okay, now my hands are touching this mouse every single day. So are there chemicals now in my mouse that are getting into my hands that I then eat my food with? And then once this mouse is disposed, where does it end up? Once it breaks down, does this end up in my soil, my waterways? Like it's a full circular, comprehensive review of a chemical, of what goes into your products and where it ends up. So it's such a big question, Cecile. It's like, what does it include? It includes everything. It's everywhere. And that's why it's so important.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, talk to us a little bit more about how workers get exposed to chemicals and how TSCA protects workers that deal with industrial chemicals every day.
Yeah, sure. I would like to build off of something Suhani was just saying. With TSCA, it really is this cradle to grave. But if you think about, there are a lot of different types of populations that touch every stage of that cradle to grave. And when you think about people who are just doing their job, put food on the table, not wanting to make a choice between their lives and their livelihoods and the kind of work that they do every day, they're touching every stage of that process. So we're talking about workers who might inhale chemicals or absorb them through their skin by touch, which is something that she was just touching upon. And this is we represent workers who make chemicals, right? So they're working at the manufacturing level. We also have workers who apply chemicals in many different forms. It can be like, liquids or sprays or, a lot of different or solid form, but you have a lot of different types of vehicles and avenues that workers are exposed to these things while doing their job. There's also the storage of chemicals and the disposal of chemicals. There are workers that transport chemicals. So if you think about all of these different stages, somebody is doing that for their job to the interfaces and is exposed to these. So it's throughout the life cycle. And then if you think about, these don't just happen at work. These are also take-home exposures. And people might remember or think about this in one of the most, historic atrocities is the asbestos situation, where many people, children and family members, are exposed to asbestos that workers have brought home with them. It's not limited to asbestos. It's, lead. It's all sorts of different, toxic dusts and other chemicals that workers bring on their clothing and their vehicles. This has been a historical issue, and it continues. There's also unborn babies are exposed in the womb, or women before they get pregnant can be exposed to chemicals that change how that baby develops. And so there's a lot of connections with people being at work, women or men or whoever, and they need protections against those chemicals. And those protections need to be strong because workers have really what we call high exposure profiles. I mean, they are exposed. Think of how many hours of work you spend or how many hours you spend at work. It is a lot of your day. It's a lot of your week. And so workers are exposed to usually higher amounts of chemicals and also for longer periods of time and also more frequently than many others. So it's a whole variety of ways. And the beautiful thing about this law is that EPA was tasked with really assessing every single stage and how those exposures happen, creating those exposure profiles, assessing the risk, and developing, requirements to be put in place so that workers can keep doing their jobs, but can keep doing them safely. And just one more thing is that, we represent at the AFL-CIO, we are a federation of 65 national unions. It means we have 15 million workers under our umbrella. But we advocate for all workers. This isn't just a union worker law. This is anybody who's exposed. So you're raising the standard, you're raising the bar of the minimum that has to be met in order to keep people protected at work.
Wow, Rebecca, I just learned something new. It's something that you don't think about, people spending their time all day at work and even thinking, bringing that home to your young children, wow. Thank you. So to go into it just a little bit more, the Toxic Substance Control Act gives EPA the authority to evaluate the risk of a chemical. And it also requires EPA to do that without considering costs or non-other risk factors, like that personal protective equipment or PPE that you were talking about earlier. And this is really important because even if a chemical is regulated by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is known as OSHA, they set rules for these types of things. EPA can't simply assume that unreasonable risk to workers is actually fixed or mitigated. Rebecca, can you expand on this a little bit more and talk about how TSCA helps set those exposure limits for workers for new and existing chemicals?
Sure. First of all, OSHA really doesn't have any of this kind of authority over new chemicals. So if a new chemical is coming on the market, the way that OSHA regulations work and the statutes that created the statute that created the agency, they have to wait for evidence of risk based on people getting sick and or people dying. That is the threshold that has become OSHA's authority over the years. And so it gives OSHA a lot of power in some ways because if there's some really some really bad stuff out there, they can take action, such as they did with the silica standard. But a new chemical coming onto the market, OSHA has no role in that, any kind of assessment or approval. EPA has all of that power. So that's very important for workers because in the new chemical space, that's something that, that the new chemicals want to come on the market. They want to put a new chemical on the market. We have to make sure that's safe for people or that the right protections are in place before it comes onto the market. And that's the really critical role, one of the critical roles that EPA plays. Otherwise, the workers who are working with that chemical, they need to be told what it is. They need to be provided the proper protections. So OSHA is not in that space. In the existing chemical space, it's also very important for EPA to have this role for workers. I talked before about how workers are such a vulnerable, what the law calls a subpopulation because of their different exposure profile. And we have seen that with all of the chemicals that EPA has assessed and managed so far. It's really been triggered by very high workplace exposures. And it's also put in much stronger protections than ever existed under OSHA. And part of that reason is because OSHA has different thresholds it has to meet and different regulatory authority. OSHA existed when this law was passed and when this law was revised. So lawmakers were very aware of the existing authority of OSHA. But EPA was given a different task, which is to assess these chemicals based only on health. Like, let's look at what it is. Let's look at what it does to people's bodies, and then let's decide what to do about it. OSHA has other factors that it has to take into account. And that's the way that, let's say their system has worked over the years. So EPA was given a very specific role in this process. And also anything that EPA has done is not inconsistent with what OSHA's done. OSHA often has much higher exposure limits. They were set a long time ago. EPA is coming in with lower exposure limits because there's a lot of updated science, but also they're looking purely at health and they're at the health risk factors. And they're saying, this is how this affects workers. We're going to set a lower exposure limit and we're going to help employers get there. Or we have to take it off the market because it just can't be there for, it's too dangerous. So there's a lot more to it, but just for sake of brevity, there's a lot in here that EPA can do and actually, change the future of the chemical situation that workers can be exposed to when they go to their jobs, that OSHA just simply doesn't have the authority to do.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit alarming how you started, just understanding the difference and understanding what you were talking about, the workers around our country. It's a whole subpopulation, and the risk factor, especially with the new chemicals, that's really alarming. So we talked a little bit on an EDF Action webinar previously about the influence that the chemical industry has on Congress to weaken these protections from toxic chemicals. But since then, 2 new proposals have been introduced, one in the House and one in the Senate. They're not formal pieces of legislation, but they're discussion drafts, and they've been discussed in committee. Suhani and Rebecca, can you both tell us, maybe we could start with Suhani on this one, what's in the proposals and how would this change how TSCA protects workers and families?
Yeah, thanks, Cecile. I'm going to go on a little bit of a soapbox here because are folks able to hear me?
Hold on, your mic, it's given like a little echo.
Oh, okay. I hope it's okay.
That's okay.
I was saying I'm going to probably go on a little bit of a soapbox here because in order to understand what's happening to TSCA now, it's a little bit important to understand how TSCA got to where it is. TSCA wasn't always a really robust statute. When it was passed back in the 70s, it didn't really give EPA the authority to regulate chemicals to its full extent. And that's why a lot of really dangerous chemicals ended up on the market for decades. Really nasty chemicals like trichloroethylene, methylene chloride, formaldehyde, asbestos, so many versions of PFAS. All of these kind of went through under what we call the old TSCA back when it was passed in the 70s. And the reason for that is because EPA wasn't given the authority by Congress to really thoroughly regulate these chemicals. All of this led up to 2016, where there was kind of this recognition that, our chemical safety law isn't really functioning the way it's supposed to. People all over our country are exposed to incredibly dangerous chemicals that haven't really undergone a thorough review. And I'm kind of monitoring the chat, and I saw someone mention, like, is this statute specific to workers? It's for everyone. I mean, everyone is impacted by TSCA because you're surrounded by products all that all have chemicals in them. So that's why TSCA is so critical. And in 2016, there was this massive reform that happened. It was a bipartisan reform. Republicans and Democrats came to the table, industry, ENGOs, health groups, labor. There were so many different and diverse organizations that joined together in 2016, all in the recognition that our chemicals law is failing us. And in 2016, the big changes that came out of it were to truly give EPA the authority to ensure that the chemicals that are leaving their review and entering our market don't pose an unreasonable risk to human health or the environment. That was a massive change in the standard and really gave kind of EPA the arms to be able to regulate these chemicals. In addition to reviewing new chemicals, EPA also now has the authority to review old chemicals. So when this law was reformed in 2016, a lot of those old laws from like the 70s up until 2016 were already grandfathered in. And that's like the big issue, right? Like once a chemical is out into the market, it's really, really hard to get back out. Like, how do I pick apart my mouse and take out every single little chemical from this? You can't. So that's why getting it right the first time is so, so important. So that affirmative safety standard is just like the bedrock of this law. But in 2016, EPA now also has the authority to look back at all of these chemicals that were grandfathered in. So it's tens of thousands of chemicals. EPA prioritizes the ones that have been known and now have science around being critically dangerous. These are ones like trichloroethylene, for example, and EPA then has the authority to provide guardrails or regulations that limit or minimize the use of TCE in certain ways. They could require certain levels of PPE now around the usage of TCE, or the EPA can outright ban a chemical because the cancer risks or just any kind of health harms around those chemicals are so incredibly high. So this is the authority that EPA now has in order to regulate our chemicals. And it is a vast improvement from what it once was. What's happening now is that our law is working. Industry, I think, has recognized that, okay, chemicals have to undergo this review. They have to be recognized for safety. They have to provide data to show the toxicity and the health impacts around their chemicals. And naturally, once these reviews take place, they do take a little bit more time. So what's happening now is that there's a really heavy industry push on the Hill to reopen the Toxic Substances Control Act. And the reason this is happening now is, one, it's a political moment in a way. But two, a really important provision of TSCA is expiring, and that is EPA's fee authority. Oh, sorry, I'm also noticing to not use abbreviations. PPE is personal protective equipment. So the Environmental Protections Agency's fee authority allows the EPA to enforce fees on industry when they're submitting a new chemical review, and those fees are what allow the office to continue to function. The authority to enforce those fees expires at the end of September. So industry is claiming that, okay, since the fees are now expiring, we're able to kind of open up this entire law and pick it apart to make it more efficient for us to get our chemicals across the finish line. And I can get really quickly into some of the provisions of these drafts that have been floating in both the House and Senate. But kind of the bottom line for a lot of these is that it minimizes so many of the standards that were established in 2016. What is being proposed right now takes us back to a standard, in some ways even worse than what it was in the 70s. It'll allow more chemicals onto the market without adequate review. More people are going to get sick. You're going to end up with chemicals in your homes and under your kitchen sink that have not been thoroughly reviewed for health and safety. And ultimately, this is an industry push. This is, once again, putting companies over people's health. And this is all happening at a time when our EPA has chemical former lobbyists at the head and making a lot of these decisions. To kind of give a quick summary of what these proposals do, they do minimize that safety standard that I mentioned was so incredibly important. They raise the bar for what EPA has to prove when they make safety determinations. So if EPA at one point had to prove 1, 2, and 3 in order to determine that a chemical is hazardous or unsafe, now they'll have to prove 1 through 10. And it just continuously raises the bar for what they have to do. And what I like to say is that what these discussion drafts do is they tie EPA's hand and then they ask EPA to swim. So it makes it really hard for the Environmental Protection Agency to do their job to protect public health. I'll stop there because I know Rebecca will probably want to talk about some of the more specific provisions around worker protections, but later in our Q&A, if folks have specific questions around the discussion draft, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Sure, I'm happy to add on to that, and feel free to add back on into anything I've missed. But these discussion drafts, yes, they are they're pretty frightening, to be honest. I would say that they are probably 3 things from our perspective. And again, this is just the worker perspective. I know I've seen some things in the chat too. This is certainly covers chemicals in all areas of life, but I'm just here to talk about the worker perspective. But this is the way that these bills, they really affect everybody. So they are, dangerous. The discussion drafts are dangerous. They're unnecessary. And what they really try to do is shift the employer's responsibility of providing a safe workplace, which is what exists under OSHA. They want to shift that back to workers. The occupational health and safety standards of our country put that responsibility on employers to provide, to maintain a safe workplace. And what these discussion drafts do is to really take anything from the good work that Suhani was talking about being done under TSCA, and really shift it back to the burden of the worker, people in their workplaces, to be able to do that when they don't have the power to do that at work. So they do weaken the chemical reviews that Suhani talked about. They ignore, some of the safer options that could replace dangerous chemicals. They allow EPA even more than lowering, lowering the bar, I guess, or lowering the bar of what needs to be proven. They also allow EPA to just prematurely determine that chemicals don't put workers at risk. So there are, these thresholds are just very different, and they can just say, we assume that workers are wearing respirators, so no big deal, they're not at risk, when we know that respirators have a lot of imperfections with them. They're also, the proposed revisions really are just unnecessary. They're making it much more incredibly technical and complex than it needs to be. The effects are very widespread. And then I would say that they're really shifting this responsibility back to OSHA, which, we know, or we already talked about a little bit, like why that is problematic. This is, EPA really was tasked with this responsibility. EPA was also tasked with stringent timelines to examine these chemicals. OSHA hasn't issued a comprehensive chemical standard in many years, and this law really gives, the good law, the existing law gives EPA these strict timelines to adhere to say, you have to assess these chemicals, you have to put out some control measures and protections for people in this time frame, whereas some uncertain time frame far and away in the future. So, and then what we have actually, what our experience is, we see the chemical industry really pushing these bills, these discussion drafts, to become bills, and saying that OSHA can do all of this. But I work with OSHA my entire career, and the chemical industry opposes every single chemical regulation. And so it's a bit confusing as well. Do you want OSHA to do this or not, right? So we're just, we think these are just, dangerous. They're unnecessary changes. We think the law is working. It's headed in the right direction, and it's being implemented in the way that Congress intended it to be.
Yes, I think you both of you had amazing points tonight, and This is just a reminder how important these protections are, and the real threat here is our health, our safety. We're talking about more chemicals that could end up in our workplaces, underneath our kitchen sinks. If you live near one of these facilities, how much more emitting and exposures you may have, and ultimately, this is we're the ones, families and workers, who end up paying the price, while you know putting corporate profits over that. So before we hop into our taking action section with Alex, I just want to open up to see if anyone had any last comments or anything you wanted the audience to take away before we jump into our action section.
Just jump in with maybe one thing. Is TSCA is bipartisan. Like, everyone cares about this. It is a widely popular law. Like, over 80% of Americans want safe chemicals. There's been so much conversation around how chemical exposures are making us sicker. And I think what's like really important to remember is that this push is coming from one perspective only, and that is industry. No one else is asking for this, and it's just taking advantage of a political moment. This is not what the people want. And I think that's like really important to remember.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if I could just add, this really is about short-term exposures to chemicals and long-term. And it's people, you might not experience an effect from a chemical exposure. I know that people certainly do experience effects in the short term, but many of these are chronic diseases. I mean, these are chronic, long-term sensitivities and allergies and cancers and reproductive and neurotoxins. I mean, this is a pretty serious. The stakes are pretty serious for people, so I just wanted to point that out because it's harder to measure and it's harder to show those effects in the short term. And then I also just want to say, it's not just workers who are exposed. It's everybody. And like I said, I represent workers. That's the perspective that I carry with it. And really in many aspects of your life, it's not like you control what you're exposed to. It's very difficult. And at work, you certainly, you're told to do your job or to go home. And so we need to farther upstream fix the problem so that, and that's what TSCA does.
Awesome. I'm going to pass it off to Alex, who's going to lead our action tonight.
Awesome. Thanks, Cecile. Hey, y'all. My name's Alex. I work with EDF Action on our grassroots engagement. And it wouldn't be an EDF Action event if we weren't taking an action. So before we dive into our Q&A for this evening, we have a special message for you to send to your members of Congress to let them know to protect these critical bedrock safety protections. And so we're going to drop a link in the chat for you to go ahead and send a message. And while we take a couple minutes to do that, Suhani, I'm wondering if I can bring you back on to talk a little bit about why now might be a good time to be reaching out to your members of Congress.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. It's a really pivotal time in Congress in the space of TSCA. There are two discussion drafts. There's one in the House, one in the Senate. They're both really, really awful in the sense that they undermine so much of the law and weaken so many critical provisions. But what's happening now is that there have been legislative hearings that have occurred in both of the committees that have jurisdiction over the Toxic Substances Control Act, and they're now kind of back at the table trying to think about language and potentially formal introduction. And it's really important that they hear not only from the industry. I think that has been such a massive kind of push on the Hill, is that they're consistently hearing from industry and trade associations and manufacturers and chemical companies, and they're not hearing from people who have been exposed to chemicals, who have had to deal with the health impacts of being near chemicals. For me, I live near an incinerator here in Baltimore City, and I moved here about 10 years ago, and over the past 5 years, I've developed asthma, and it's been awful. I'm a runner, and it's just impacted my life every day. So every time I go onto the Hill, I do tell my story that my environment and the chemicals around me impact me a lot. And it's really important that our government does its job to be able to help us feel protected and truly keep us away from exposures that will hurt us. But the discussion drafts right now on the Hill, they potentially have legs. These could very much move. We've heard that it is a priority for folks in leadership on the Senate. And we don't really want to see this come into fruition, especially in this political time. So it's a really pivotal moment for folks to take action and sign on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Suhani. Yeah, I can't agree more. You need to make your voice heard, or else they're going to try to get rid of it. So with that, I will hand it back over to Cecile to guide our Q&A session.
Thanks. So there's a lot of good questions in the chat. One of them is under and at the direction of the Trump EPA has turned its back on its mandate. So how do you think EPA will do its job in this respect?
Rebecca, do you want to answer it? Would you like me to take a first crack at it?
Either way, I'll start. You should definitely finish.
Yeah.
So yes, the Trump administration EPA isn't doing everything that it should be doing or that was assigned to it. Certainly, they have cut staffing, they've cut funding, they've proposed to cut more funding. There are many people working on this law in particular, as well as others, that they're just not there to do as much of it. So at the same time that we're fighting to keep these protections in this law, we are fighting to make sure that that those departments are also staffed up, that they're resourced, and that Congress, congressional oversight really matters, and that Congress reminds the agency of its mandate and holds their hand to it, because that's a significant role of Congress.
Mm-hmm. So Hannah, you want to add on at all?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I think that's a really great point. And I'll also just add that the Toxic Substance Control Act is black letter law. Like it's not meant to ebb and flow with administrations, although implementation obviously can change between administrations. We see right now with the Trump EPA, they have dismantled the independent research leg. They're disregarding science. They're rolling back so many of the existing chemical regulations that they have found are delaying them, so they won't be implemented. But foundationally, like, TSCA should stand. It's like you can change the paint color of a house, but you don't want to blow the whole house up. And I think that's what's trying to happen right now, right? Like they're trying to completely fundamentally rip apart a law versus just changing a paint color, which can sometimes happen between administrations. But of course, we want an administration to implement TSCA to its full extent, be fully funded. That's been such a big issue that EDF Action has advocated for, to fully fund the TSCA office, to make sure that they do have the staff and resources to be able to do their job. But yeah, I think the importance of being able to uphold black letter law is so critical.
Absolutely, because this isn't just a piece of legislation. These pieces of legislation have impacts on all of our lives. And, just to see some of these stories in the chat, we're talking about Michelle Mastro. Her son just beat cancer and she thinks her home is making her sick. Christine also in the comments says her father had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and worked with glyphosate. And in 1992, one of our members was exposed to neurotoxins and toxic chemicals because of building materials in a sealed office building, and became allergic to chemical legislation, and he was acknowledging how then the regulations weren't as strong. So this conversation couldn't be more important. We're talking about a political moment, but we also have to acknowledge these are our everyday lives. There's one more question I think we can get to before we wrap up tonight. There's a question in here that says, what is your sense of the GOP opposition to re-upping the regulations and making them stronger?
We can try and take a crack at this. So I think a lot of the influence right now at EPA is a vested interest. The folks that are kind of leading up the TSCA office within EPA have former ties to the chemical lobby and the trade industry and manufacturing. So they've been on the side of industry, and I think they kind of recognize the changes that or the implementations that they can make within the EPA to kind of favor industry or tip the scales a little bit more for industry to rush their chemicals across the finish line, or maybe not fully or thoroughly review chemicals prior to them going onto the market. So I think that is kind of the sense right now in the administration. And I'll say that, like, the administrator has also pushed the toxics office within EPA to expedite chemicals that are being used in data centers. And I know that that's like a really big hot topic for so many reasons, but from a chemical perspective, you're talking about potentially streamlining and expediting reviews of chemicals that could be really dangerous, many of them including PFAS, for the sake of trying to move along and quickly develop data centers. So it's kind of an all around approach right now to attack this law. It's happening in the administration. We have the GOP and in Congress kind of at being very heavily swayed right now by industry and the chemical industry. So it's an all around attempt that we are seeing to really dismantle this law, unfortunately.
Thanks, Suhani. Rebecca, one last question for you. Someone mentioned, how are women protected by TSCA?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, women are a vulnerable population to chemical exposures. Chemical exposures affect men and women differently, and I think we need to remember that exposures that women have now, whether it's in the workplace or it's in your communities, can affect you long term. And I think people think, like, if I'm not pregnant right now, then I have to be careful when I am. But actually, it's even before you get pregnant. There's a lot of evidence that shows that does affect babies later on, and like I said, the development and many other factors. So it's women are affected in many of those ways, and also in the workplace, there's a lot of like personal protective equipment, the PPE thing that some folks are talking about. PPE is, it's a good tool to have, but it's not the end all be all. There's much better controls in the workplace, like designing better engineering systems, better ventilation, isolating workers from the chemical they're using through like a barrier or booth. But just to say that there's been historical and recent issues with PPE not being made properly to fit women. So even if we're relying on PPE for some certain chemical exposures, women don't have the same fit. And now companies are being forced to kind of, make PPE better so that it fits many different types of bodies. But just to say, women bear children, and so they have different effects than men do. And part of EPA's mandate is to look at how all of these things are different and who gets put at higher risk than others. It's not always the women who are the highest risk, but it really does depend on the chemical. And there's, a lot of men that face very particular cancers due to certain chemicals, and women for others. And so it's just, but we have to study them to know them, and we have to put those prevention measures in place so that people don't have the exposures.
Thanks, Rebecca. Well, y'all, sadly, our time tonight is coming to an end. Just want to thank everyone again for joining us online. Thanks to Rebecca and Suhani for taking time to have this really important and engaging conversation. Whether you're on YouTube or EDF Action's social media feed, please like and share this video and this content with your network. Sign up for some future events on our Mobilize page at the address on the screen, and we'll see you next time.